part of what I do is work with people who are preparing to be art teachers, K-12 art teachers. That's accurate. Work with artists. I've taught studio-based courses in ceramics, drawing, and also working with grad students who are interested in engaging in research about and through and within art practices, visual culture practices. So there's this range of folks with whom I'm working. So I'm trying to negotiate a place to enter, Larry. And one of the things that you said was, so how explicit am I with, this, as we've been calling it, this hidden agenda, right? Or hidden curriculum. Which
Not
is
a hidden agenda.
No, but it's the same thing, right?
Oh,
in
well,
many cases, it's the same thing, right? Because you have an agenda that you're trying to cover, whether it's an official agenda, we can correlate that to the official curriculum. And I'm pulling this term, these curriculum pieces from the work of George Posner and others, right? Where you might consider there are 5 kinds of curriculum that are happening at the same time. 5 concurrent curricula. He says there's the official curriculum, which is what is written down, is that officially mandated, this is what will be taught. Then there's the operational curriculum, is what you put into practice. It's how you operationalize it, right? So it could be the official agenda, then the operationalized agenda, right? So agenda and curriculum, to me, agenda gets a bad rap, I think, just like propaganda, but that's a different kettle of horses. Okay, so then the third curriculum that Posner talks about is the hidden curriculum. What is not official, what is not officially written down and intended, and what also is not necessarily operationalized intentionally, but it is what is hidden and gets learned and taught at the same time. The fourth would then be the null curriculum, what is not taught, what is not intended to be taught, what is absent and explicitly missing. And then the fifth is the extra curriculum, what doesn't happen inside those intentional spaces that we might think as formalized schooling. So if we think of, you're on the volleyball team, that's extracurricular, but it's still related to that educational space. All 5 of those things are happening all the time. So the hidden agenda, the hidden curriculum, is one that and there's some tension there, right? Because in some cases it's operationalized with a conscious awareness that it's hidden, I'm not going to be explicit about it. But then there can be a hidden curriculum where it's being taught and learned without the intention of it being taught and learned. When we ask kids to, for example, there are bathrooms, when I was a kid, there were gendered bathrooms, men's bathrooms, and there were boys and girls, and so it's teaching us certain things about how society is structured. But when we move and have a shift in our cultural and social space where bathrooms don't have to have certain labels, then other knowledge, other ideas are taught and learned through those gestures, but they're not necessarily official. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so the program where I teach at Penn State in art education, also at VCFA, we're very explicit about what that hidden agenda might be, is to the point where it's not hidden at all. It's very upfront, it's very official, and it gets operationalized in terms of a focus on social justice, a focus on the role of artists and art in the world, and what matters matter, and how we can engage with concepts like such as, and theories, like we heard in the introduction, feminist theory, or critical race theory, or critical pedagogy, or we can think about anti-racist theory, right? So we can think about, or disability studies, all of these different ways in which society operates are part of the curriculum that I've been part of in these 2 institutions, to look at the preparation of teachers. So someone who says, hey, I want to go study in this program, it's not a surprise to them when we start talking about feminist pedagogy and feminist issues. What might be a surprise is perhaps the ways in which we approach that and then operationalize it, but it shouldn't be a surprise. Now, in some cases, some people might not always read the fine print, but and then there might be a surprise there. But I don't hide those issues. As a matter of fact, I'm very upfront with my undergraduates about, in this course we're going to learn about learning, and I'm more interested in learning than I am in teaching. And that doesn't make sense to a lot of people who are preparing to be teachers or think about teaching, because to frame it around learning suggests there's a shift from the agency of the teacher as the primary vehicle to the student.
Do I need a first course where there's no interference with learning to draw basics in a basic way, and then after that I can come to a second level drawing class where you can lay on all this other stuff? Or from the very beginning, in even the most rudimentary learning of the medium, are you already insinuating into the design of this curriculum this other set of concerns? I don't have to know anything about the basics independent of this second concern to start learning this other set of things?
Yeah. No, one can enter with the concerns.
And that is your plan most of the time?
All of the time.
All the time.
All the
Okay.
time.
All
So
right.
we start with let's say social issues, or let's say we're grounding the course within a social space, right? We all live in a social space. We all come with a set of concerns. We all come with a set of experiences. We come to the studio and then return to wherever we were before that. What we experience outside of the studio is content for art making. Is content for engagement through art. So this is a shift where we think of so if we take a step back to notions of curriculum, a very basic question in curriculum design, curriculum theory, curriculum development, I should say, is what is worth knowing, right? What content do we want students to learn? What is worth knowing? We might then look through the progression of curriculum theory, and then folks, about 30, 40 years ago, start making a shift and start saying, what is worthwhile, what matters? And what happens is there's a movement away from a more modernist notion of art as material-based to art as a reflection and engagement within the world. Not that it hadn't been that way before, but that the world becomes an art-making medium and a context that can be not only reflected and depicted, but can also be used as one of the materials within art-making practice, and that art practice can have some sort of engaged and intentional effect within that. So, the kind of drawing class that you're mentioning or describing is not uncommon. These kinds of courses happen quite often, but their titles don't always reflect that, and many art schools are making some shifts. I mentioned to a colleague a number of years ago. I said, we really need to change the names of some of these courses. Like we should have, Art with Larry, Art 505, Art with Larry, and then Art 507, Art with Steve, and they would have a sense of what that course was about. It's not a materials specific course, although it could be. But when we move the focus to issues, ideas, concerns, engagements, problems, ideas, that is an easier entry point for the kinds of pedagogy that we're talking about, that lend themselves to the sensibilities of disruptive practices, of social consciousness, of transformative learning.
And what I've taken from your comments on occasion is that I ought to have that objective if I'm going to teach people about operating in their community. Don't just teach the method or the content, but get to this other level and build that into the curriculum. Take responsibility for that, be explicit about it, be accountable, not just during, but even before.
That's right.
Although who knows whether they would have let me anywhere near the place if I had said at the beginning, our goal here is to bring about change in this community.
Well, it depends on your strategy there, right? So if we think about it this way, and you didn't mention this in your story, but I would be interested in this component because it also then gets back to one of those parts of the longer question you asked me earlier about my own students, my own teaching. This is part of the social studies curriculum, officially, right? There should be some objectives. There should be some state standards or district objectives that many teachers consider to be the curriculum and they teach to those standards or to those objectives. I teach my students, put those aside, let's build on what you know, what is most important, what, you know, build on your own politics, build on let's start with the themes and the ideas and the concerns that you have, build your curriculum around that, drawing on your art practice, your knowledge of art, and then let's compare, let's use those standards or those objectives as an assessment. Now, how many of those do we address? Usually, we can cover all of those. But if we start the other way around, we start with, you know, learning objective 6 and learning objective 8, and this is the lesson, it's going to be really narrow and tight, and you're always going to be interested in, we got to kick it back into the center. We got to make sure but in the way that you did it, I would imagine you could have said at any given moment when you felt some resistance, well, if we look at the standards, we're covering X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because, and this is a way that I'm not trying to say this is how you do a cover-up story, but this is how you can justify this social practice, social engagement, social consciousness pedagogy is you say, look, we're meeting all of the standards. As a matter of fact, if we were to do, let's say, 3 units like this over the course of the year, we could hit all of those objectives each time. If we do it in a more conventional approach, we might only address one of those objectives once, or a few of them very superficially. So this becomes an even more potent way to make a case, because you're using you were talking about values.
Using the objectives against them.
Yes, I call it playing judo. Yeah, you use your opponent's strength and speed to your advantage.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, when I teach graduate students who are in a professional degree program, all of this is easily talked about. It's layered into the social objectives, the social change impact. It's all easily included in the conversation, and there's explicit reflection on the social impact, social implications, social change, or who wins, who loses if you do this, and so on. It's fascinating to me that you're teaching teachers who are teaching kids in elementary school, and you're, in a sense, teaching the same thing, and you're not really modulating that much. You're still saying, there's biases here, everyone has a bias, you learn what you're including, what you're not including, and it sounds like you would say that to every level and to the teachers teaching at every level. And that was surprising to me that all of this was as explicit in your curriculum, in your teaching for K through 12 as it is in teaching professionals.
Yeah. Let me give you a couple examples to say yes, to support what you're saying. So there are a number of courses that one might find in an undergraduate or pre-service art education curriculum, right? You can imagine there's this, has to be a 101 or, art education 101, right? Intro. And then there has to be the student teaching at the other end, and somewhere in there's a practicum course. Many places have methods courses. There's usually a history course or a cultural practices or a cultural foundations course. And there's also a curriculum course. And depends on what institution where I'm teaching, but usually if it's the curriculum course or the cultural and social foundations course, first day of class, this is how I start the class. Now, we've known each other for almost 2 years now, and we've sat through these conversations, so you know what I look like, you know what I sound like. But imagine students who are just showing up to class for the first time, right? And this is how I start the class. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Carpenter, and I'll be your instructor this semester. So for the next 16 weeks, we'll be engaging in curriculum and cultural and social issues related to art education. Now, some of you come to the course as artists, and others come and I continue in just this way, and we start to read the syllabus. And at a certain point, I just can't do this, or I cannot find different regions of the UK to move around my accent, And certain students start to see and look. And then I say, well, now the next thing that we're going to do, and I change my voice like this, and they're looking at me like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And I stop them right there. This is the first day of class, Larry. Say, you haven't blinked in a minute, and your mouth is wide open, and you're giggling, and what's going on here? And And I make them talk. I say, well, what's up? Well, you sound different. I sound different than what? Well, you sound different than you did before. Well, what did I sound like before? Well, you had an accent. Oh, I did? What kind of accent? Well, so, well, you know, if I'm someplace else, I have an accent there, but when I'm home, I don't have an accent. People who sounded like that at home don't have an accent. It's only when they leave. And so what else is different? And they also end up talking about, well, I move them to the space to say, faces that look like mine, in most people's conception, at least in the institutions where I teach, don't sound like that. Or the conception of someone with an accent like that looks different than I do. So, but I put it on the table, and I draw attention to what this pigmentation looks like, and what it sounds like to talk like this, you know, or if I talk like this, or I have so the idea of how accents inform and influence biases. That's it. Day one, I say, so how do you sound when you talk to your students? How does your language, how does the way you dress speak to your students? And also, how do you respond to your students based on what they sound like and what they, day one.
And you wouldn't, I mean, that's not keyed to the age or level of the, of the students.
Yeah. So this becomes part of what it means to be a teacher. So if you're interested in teaching learners, you have multiple identities in that space. But if you're going to assume that a learner is a learner is a learner is a learner, it's much easier. You just kind of deliver stuff and expect it to come back in the same way. It's not messy at all. For the younger ones, so I'm also spending this year as an artist and learner in residence at an elementary school in my town. So I visit the first grader, a class of first graders, just about every Friday, and then I'm working with the entire third grade team.
Who's third grade?
No, that's okay. Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because one of the things I've been doing with the third graders is looking at the water crisis, and I know some of you are interested in the water crisis, global water crisis. So in third grade, Africa is one of their social studies units. It worked out really quite well in connection with the African diaspora water curriculum that I've been working on that was funded by the Africana Research Center at Penn State. And so we talked about, to talk to them about the water crisis in Africa, there's a moment in which for some learners and for some teachers, there could be a moment where you equate Africa, no water. All Africans have no water. Is that right? I have to call that out. There's also a moment where, and this happens beyond third grade, where it happens in the news, it happens in TV shows, it happens in textbooks, it happens in daily conversation, where people will say, I'm going on a trip, multiple places. I'm going to fly to France, and I'm going to go to Germany, and I'm going to go to Africa. Really? You're going to go to a continent? Where we frame Africa as an entire country. And for those third graders to learn what do I mean by that? To learn that Africa is a country? No. Africa is one continent made of multiple countries. Somehow that doesn't always happen, at least, and so the message then in society is one that needs to be attended to, right? I mean, it certainly then lends itself to biases or misunderstandings about the continent. So I make it clear to the third graders. So, but this is how I do it. So, and I put a map of Africa up and say, so here's the country of Africa, and we're going to talk. No, what do you mean? It's not with a little bit of joking, with a little teasing, to make sure, and enable them and allow them to make explicit what they're hearing, and to continue to do that is quite important. Walter Bateman, there's a book by Walter Bateman. He wrote, I think after he retired from College of Education, I think he was at University of Minnesota. But it's called Teaching Through Inquiry. And one of the strategies that he uses that I borrow, or he writes about in this book, is, it's based in the Socratic method, but it's also based in this notion of inquiry through the process of asking questions one can reveal. But to make sure students are paying attention, you can provide information that's factual, not factual, factual, and see when and how they pick up on it. And I love doing that with the younger kids. Or when it's time to share. So then another component is I've been sharing with the students challenges, design challenges that are drawn directly from lack of adequate access to water in different countries in Africa, as exemplified from different places. So whether it's the water filter, or pumping water, or piping water, or transporting water, or collecting water out of the air through moisture. So I say, look, here's an example. Imagine you live in a rural town, and you have an amazing access to water, but it's filled with disease and mosquito larvae and all this. I'd like you to design a way to filter that water, but you can't use any electricity, and you can't use any oil or any gas. No mode of motion or power other than the human body. Divide into a group of 2, 3, 4, and draw this. And I give them 10 minutes. These are 8-year-olds, right? 8 and 9-year-olds. And they go away and they draw it, and then when they share these things. This is the same challenge that that designers are dealing with in the world right now. Their drawings are incredible. The conversations they're having are incredible. But the way I frame it is, imagine you lived in a town, blah, 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 blah. I don't say, imagine you lived in this African village. And to take it away from that, although they are studying Africa, I take it away from that and make it a more generic space for them to think through. Then I say, well, in certain countries in Africa, this is the case, just like in certain states in this country, just like in other countries in the world. So I don't just leave it there. Making it explicit with the students is very, very important. And they get it. Yeah.
I'm still on this idea that there's this special quality about being a socially disruptive artist, or being a teacher who's trying to take this into account. And all the other things that we try to help people get better at teaching or better at doing something doesn't get at this core quality. 'Cause I think it is different and special and scary and
I think it's all of those
things.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. I also, maybe you recall, I said, when I'm doing the water fountain work, I still get anxious to approach
so you don't know what's going to haul off and belt you.
They might do this. Watching all these YouTube videos tells me, other people, this happens to folks all the time. But it's the social engagement that is an important part of the materiality of that work, just like clay is an important material part of ceramics, obviously. And not everybody is as able and with all media as they would like to be, or teaching and learning certain content. So that's just an understanding.
Yeah, but this is different in kind than learning another medium. I'm terrible at watercolor, but watch me go when I do something else. Okay, I can get better at it. You can teach me to get better at it. I'm not great at it. I've never been good at it, but okay, if I put enough effort in and you give me coaching and I try it and I watch it, I'll get better. I just have a sense that being ready to commit to engage in public spaces in something aimed at changing the way people think about things or challenging their identity is not something that you can build the capacity in the same way.
So this is how I want to answer this question another way, because I think we're going around on the same question. And I appreciate the provocations. So if I think about the most recent semester where I taught the participatory inquiry course, a range of students in this course, one student from, I believe she's in sociology or comparative literature, perhaps, comparative literature, was not about to perform, to do the reading in public, but was very interested in graphic novels, comics, visual representation, and and the issue she was interested in was this conversation on campus about unionizing graduate students, right? And so was kind of concerned about, well, how do I perform unionizing and the political issues there? So we talked about her interest in graphic novels and comics, and what she ended up doing was, essentially it was a survey of sorts, asking people to provide her with feedback, their perspective on this issue, on unionization of grad students, and with little drop boxes where they could, it's almost like the suggestion boxes, right? And she put them in strategic places, collected them, and then did graphic, visual depictions, almost like cartoon, each on these squares, panels, and then post with the speech bubbles, with the content as was the content from those suggestions, the anonymous suggestions that people gave her, and then she would post these on bulletin boards, so you could see this public display of comments. She physically put this in the world, but she didn't physically put herself in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we're playing
Yeah.
to her strengths that way.
Yeah.
And that's why the particulars of what she was about, what she was interested in, what she was capable,
that makes
that's where that
sense to
went.
me.
Another student who was in architecture was interested in, so on our campus, I don't know how it happens around Cambridge and around MIT, but we have different representatives from different religions or different beliefs who will set up in different parts of campus, and they're allowed to do that, and they'll pass out literature, and they'll engage people in conversation. And so what this one student did was he wanted to emulate he wanted to borrow their mode, their presentation, but not their message. He wanted to actually substitute out their message of religion and spirituality with concepts from architecture. And so he
Sounds a little strange.
Okay. Exactly. So so imagine you're walking down the sidewalk and someone says, "Oh, may I talk to you about being saved, or may I talk to you about spiritual enlightenment or whatever?" And then instead of doing that, he said, "Well, do you have a moment, because I'd like to talk to you about the differences between concrete and cement and their uses in architectural structures." I'm thinking, what? But he's dressed as if...
Sounds like a really MIT thing.
Right? But he's dressed as someone that you might see on campus in the guise of a spiritual or a religious practice. So in that way, he felt very comfortable doing that. But it was about, well, how do you take on that persona without... He wasn't trying to... He was trying to use that visual as momentum.
And so you play to his strength.
You play to their strengths.
There are a lot of ways of doing this. You're playing to people's strengths.
That's what it's about.
Yeah, I like that.